Hello, everyone. Tonight we cross into a world where survival hangs by a thread as thin as frost on stone. As the medieval heard the wind howl and let the stone hearth cool, they knew winter was no longer a season, it was a sentence. Before we begin this journey through ice and endurance, if you enjoy stories that help you unwind and drift into peaceful sleep, please subscribe to the channel. We share tales like this one, crafted to calm your mind and carry you gently into rest. Now, settle in, dim the lights, and let's step back into a time when cold wasn't just felt, it was survived. The expedition began in autumn, when the air still held the memory of warmth. 12 men departed from a Norse settlement on the edge of the known world, guided by rumors of a passage through the northern ice, a route that would shorten trade by weeks, if it existed at all. They carried little: dried fish, salted meat, wool cloaks heavy enough to weigh down a smaller man, and hope, always hope. William led them, not because he was the strongest, but because he had sailed these waters before. His hands bore scars from frozen rigging, his eyes had seen ice that moved like living walls. He knew cold the way farmers know soil, intimately, respectfully. Beside him stood Thomas, younger but steady, a carpenter by trade, who understood how wood and rope could hold against impossible forces. Edmund, the oldest, spoke little but watched everything. His beard had gone white years ago, and he moved with the deliberate care of someone who had survived by never rushing. The others, Robert, John, Peter, Hugh, Simon, Geoffrey, Alan, and young Martin, filled roles as needed: rowers, fishermen, repairers of sails, each man chosen not for glory, but for the quiet competence that keeps people alive when glamour fades. They sailed north as September gave way to October. The sea remained navigable, though the wind sharpened daily. They spoke less as cold increased, conserving energy, their breath visible even at midday. What none of them knew, not even William, was how quickly the ice would arrive. The first true warning came on a morning so still it felt unnatural. The water around their longboat had thickened overnight, not yet solid, but no longer fully liquid. Slush clung to the oars. Each stroke required effort that hadn't been necessary the day before. William stood at the bow, scanning the horizon. Gray water met gray sky without seam or boundary. In the distance, pale shapes drifted, icebergs, larger than any they'd encountered so far. "We're too far north," Edmund said quietly, moving beside him. William didn't answer immediately. He knew Edmund was right. The passage they'd been told about should have appeared by now, a channel through ice that would lead them onward. Instead, the sea was closing. "One more day," William said finally. "If we don't find it, we turn back." Edmund nodded, though his expression suggested doubt. Turning back meant admitting failure.
It also meant surviving. Both men understood the calculus. By afternoon, the wind rose, not dramatically but steadily, pushing from the north with increasing insistence. The temperature dropped sharply. Frost formed on the edges of the boat, delicate at first, then stubborn and thick. Thomas worked quickly to secure their supplies beneath oiled canvas. Water that splashed aboard froze before it could drain away. The deck became treacherous, each step requiring attention. That night they did not stop rowing. Stopping meant drifting. Drifting meant letting the ice decide their position. They rowed in shifts, 4 men at a time, while others huddled beneath cloaks, stealing warmth where they could. Young Martin, only 16, struggled more than the others. His hands stiffened quickly, and he fumbled with knots that should have been simple. Thomas stayed close, guiding him without words, showing him how to tuck fingers into armpits between tasks, how to keep blood moving. No one complained. Complaint used energy they could not spare. But as dawn approached, pale and reluctant, the truth became undeniable. The sea had frozen around them overnight. Not completely, but enough. The boat could no longer move forward freely. They were trapped. Not dramatically, not suddenly, but gradually and completely. The ice had closed like a fist around the longboat, holding it fast. Pushing forward became impossible. The oars struck solid surface now, achieving nothing. William called a halt. The men gathered near the center of the boat, exhausted and cold. Their breath rose in clouds that hung briefly before dispersing into air that seemed hungry for warmth. "We wait," William said. His voice was steady, but his eyes betrayed concern. Ice moves, it shifts. A channel will open. No one argued. Arguing solved nothing. But several men exchanged glances that spoke volumes. They had food for perhaps 3 weeks, if rationed carefully. They had fuel for fire, driftwood carried from the settlement, that might last half that time if used sparingly. What they did not have was shelter. The longboat, magnificent for sailing, offered no protection against sustained cold. Wind moved freely across the deck. Snow, when it fell, settled everywhere without resistance. The men were exposed completely, reliant on layers of wool and fur that grew heavier as moisture froze into the fabric. Edmund began organizing. He'd seen crews frozen before, years ago, and he knew that survival depended on routine. Tasks, movement, purpose. "We rotate watch," he announced. 2 men always moving, checking the ice for cracks, keeping circulation. The rest huddled together, sharing warmth. Every 4 hours, we switch. It was simple, practical, and brutally honest about their situation. Movement kept blood flowing. Huddling preserved heat. Isolation killed. Thomas set about creating a crude shelter using the sail.
He rigged canvas to block wind from one section of the boat, creating a pocket where several men could cluster. It wasn't much, but it helped. The difference between exposed cold and slightly sheltered cold mattered. That first full day passed slowly. Time stretched when there was nothing to do but endure. They ate sparingly, a handful of dried fish, a few pieces of hard bread. Fire was lit only at midday, and they gathered close, absorbing warmth while it lasted. The cold here felt different from anything they'd known. It wasn't simply the absence of warmth. It was aggressive, active, searching constantly for exposed skin, for gaps in clothing, for any weakness it could exploit. But they endured, and when night fell again, bringing darkness that seemed absolute, they huddled closer, layering bodies against the wind, and waited. The ice did not open, not the next day nor the day after. A week passed, then 10 days. The boat remained locked in place, part of a frozen sea that stretched endlessly in all directions. Routine became survival. Wake when light appeared. Move stiff limbs carefully until blood flowed. Eat a measured portion. Rotate watch. Huddle together. Sleep in shifts, never deeply, always aware of the cold pressing in. The men grew quieter as days blended together. Conversation faded, replaced by gestures and glances. Speaking used energy. Warmth was currency, and they hoarded it instinctively. Young Martin struggled most visibly. His youth, which should have been an advantage, worked against him. He lacked the layers of experience that taught older men how to conserve energy, how to find stillness in discomfort. Thomas stayed close to him, a quiet presence that required no words. He showed Martin how to wrap his hands inside his cloak, how to curl into a shape that preserved heat, how to breathe slowly to reduce the sting of frozen air in his lungs. William, meanwhile, climbed onto the ice each day, surveying their surroundings. The ice stretched unbroken in all directions, a white desert that offered no landmarks, no sense of progress or change. Sometimes he thought he saw movement in the distance, other ice shifting, perhaps, but it never came closer. Edmund managed supplies with careful precision. He counted every piece of fish, every scrap of bread. They had enough for perhaps 2 more weeks, if no one ate their full share. After that, decisions would have to be made. No one spoke about what those decisions might involve. Fire remained their greatest challenge. The driftwood burned too quickly. They learned to light fires only once per day, gathering close for an hour of warmth that felt miraculous and brief. Smoke rose straight upward in the still air, disappearing into a sky that offered no comfort. On the 14th day, something changed. Robert, on watch, called out sharply. His voice, unused for hours, cracked slightly. Movement. East side. The men stirred immediately, pulling themselves from huddled positions. William moved to the edge of the boat, staring in the direction Robert indicated. At first, he saw nothing. Then, gradually, he noticed it. A thin, dark line cutting across the white expanse. Water. Open water. The ice was shifting. Hope, dangerous and electric, moved through the group. They didn't celebrate. They were too cold, too worn for celebration. But posture changed. Eyes sharpened. Hands moved more quickly. "How far?" William asked. "Half a mile, maybe less," Robert answered. "Hard to judge." Thomas began preparing immediately. If the ice continued shifting, if a channel opened wide enough, they might be able to push the boat forward. It would require strength they barely had, but possibility was fuel in itself. They watched through the day as the crack widened. Slowly, impossibly slowly, water revealed itself. Dark and cold, but liquid. Movement meant freedom. By evening, the channel was perhaps 30 feet across, still distant, but closer than it had been. William made the decision. Tomorrow, at first light, we push. Everyone, all at once. The men nodded. They would have one chance. If they failed, exhaustion would claim them. If they succeeded, they might reach that water and row again. That night, no one truly slept. They lay together beneath the canvas shelter, bodies pressed close, minds turning over what morning would bring. The cold felt sharper, as if sensing their intent. But when dawn arrived, pale and indifferent, they rose. They moved stiff limbs, forced frozen joints to flex, and gathered at the sides of the boat. William positioned himself at the bow. Together, on my count. They pushed. The boat didn't move, not at first. Ice held it firmly, unwilling to release its grip. The men strained, muscles burning despite the cold, breath coming in harsh gasps that crystallized instantly. Again, William commanded. They pushed harder. Somewhere deep in the ice, something cracked. A sound like distant thunder rolled beneath them. The boat shifted. Just an inch, but it shifted. Again. This time momentum built. The hull scraped against ice, a sound that set teeth on edge. Slowly, with agonizing resistance, the boat began to move forward. Foot by foot, they pushed it across frozen surface. Sweat formed despite the cold, immediately chilling against skin. Arms trembled, back strained, but the boat moved. Martin slipped, falling hard onto ice. Thomas pulled him up without stopping, and together they rejoined the effort. No one could falter. Every body mattered. The channel of open water grew closer. 10 feet, 5. Then with a final collective heave, the bow reached the edge and tipped forward. The boat slid into water with a splash that sounded impossibly loud in the frozen silence. They'd done it. For a moment, exhaustion overwhelmed them. Men collapsed against the sides of the boat, gasping, bodies shaking from effort. But there was no time to rest. The channel might close again. They had to move while they could.
William called for oars. Hands, nearly too stiff to obey, found familiar positions, and slowly, painfully, they began to row. The water felt different here, thicker, resistant, as if reluctant to allow passage. Ice floated around them in chunks that bumped against the hull. But they moved. After weeks of stillness, they moved. They rowed for hours, following the narrow channel as it wound through ice. Sometimes it narrowed dangerously, forcing them to push against frozen walls with oars and hands. Sometimes it widened, offering brief relief. By afternoon, exhaustion threatened to stop them completely. Muscles had nothing left. But stopping meant drifting back into ice that might close permanently. Edmund, watching, made a calculation. "Fire," he said quietly to William, "now, while we move." It was risky. Lighting fire on a moving boat with wind and ice around them invited disaster, but warmth might give them strength to continue. Thomas rigged a small brazier in the center of the boat, shielding it carefully. Using their precious fuel, he coaxed flame to life. Smoke rose, then bent in the wind, but heat followed. The men took turns rotating close to it, absorbing warmth that felt like life itself returning. Fingers loosened, breath came easier, and strength, just enough strength, returned. They rowed onward. Night fell while they were still moving. The channel remained open, though ice pressed close on both sides. Darkness made navigation treacherous. William, at the bow, called out directions based more on instinct than sight. The temperature dropped further. Frost formed on their beards, on their eyelashes, on the oars themselves. Each stroke became harder as wood stiffened in the cold. But they didn't stop, couldn't stop. This channel was their only hope. Around midnight, young Martin collapsed. His oar clattered to the deck as his body simply gave out. Thomas caught him before he could roll overboard, easing him down gently. "He's breathing," Thomas reported, "just exhausted." William nodded. "He rose again when he can. The rest of us continue." It was harsh but necessary. Sentiment wouldn't save them. Forward movement would. They rowed through the night, taking turns sleeping in brief intervals, always keeping the boat moving. The channel twisted and turned, sometimes seeming to lead nowhere, then opening again unexpectedly. When dawn finally arrived, bringing thin gray light, they saw it. Land. Not close, but visible. A dark line against the white horizon. Mountains, perhaps, or steep coastal cliffs. It didn't matter what it was solid ground. Hope, that dangerous emotion, surged again. The men rowed harder, finding reserves they hadn't known existed. Martin woke and joined them, his movements weak but determined. The channel continued toward the land, widening as they went. Ice became less dense. Water moved more freely.
By midday, they could see details: rocky shore, patches of dark vegetation clinging to hillsides, and most importantly, smoke. Someone lived there. They reached the shore as afternoon light was failing. The boat scraped against rocks, a sound that felt impossibly solid after weeks surrounded by ice. For a moment, no one moved. They sat in the boat, staring at land they thought they might never see again. Then William stood, carefully, and stepped onto stone. It held him. Solid, unmoving, real. One by one, the others followed. Legs, unused to walking on stable ground, buckled. Men caught each other, laughing weakly at their own unsteadiness. The laughter was thin, but genuine. Young Martin dropped to his knees and pressed his forehead against cold stone, muttering words of gratitude to whatever gods might be listening. Thomas began securing the boat, working automatically despite exhaustion. Edmund counted their remaining supplies. 3 days of food, perhaps, if they were careful. The fuel was gone completely. "We need shelter," William said, his voice rough from disuse and cold. "And fire." The smoke they'd seen came from somewhere inland, beyond a rise. William gestured for 3 men to accompany him: Thomas, Robert, and Edmund. The others would stay with the boat and began setting up what shelter they could. The small group moved inland, climbing slowly over rocks slick with ice. Their bodies protested every step, muscles stiff and joints aching, but they pushed forward. Beyond the rise they found it, a small settlement, perhaps a dozen buildings clustered together, stone structures with turf roofs, built low against the wind. Smoke rose from several, speaking of fire and warmth within. People moved between the buildings, wrapped in furs, going about daily tasks with the practiced efficiency of those who live where they do because they must, not because they choose. William approached slowly, hands visible, making no sudden movements. A man noticed them first, stopping mid-step to stare. Then he called out, and others emerged. The language they spoke was familiar enough to understand, though the accent was thick. Norse, but altered by isolation and time. "Where do you come from?" an older woman asked, her eyes sharp as she studied them. "South," William answered simply. "Our boat was trapped in ice. We've been frozen for weeks." The woman's expression didn't soften exactly, but something shifted. Recognition, perhaps. Understanding. She'd seen travelers caught by ice before. "You're fortunate," she said. "Most don't escape once the ice takes them." She paused. "You have injured?" William shook his head. "Exhausted, cold, but alive." She nodded. "Bring your men. We have fire, food. You'll work while you heal. We all work here, but you'll survive the winter." It was blunt, practical, and exactly what they needed to hear. The settlement was called Greystone, named for the rocks that dominated the landscape. 43 people lived there, making their existence through fishing, hunting seal, and trading with other isolated communities when summer allowed. They lived with cold the way William's crew had survived it, by adapting completely. Their homes were built half underground, taking advantage of Earth's insulation. Thick turf roofs blocked wind. Inside, stone hearths burned constantly, fueled by seal oil and driftwood collected obsessively during warmer months. The people of Greystone watched William's crew with cautious interest. Visitors were rare. Visitors who arrived in winter were nearly unheard of. But hospitality, in places like this, wasn't optional. It was survival. Turning away those in need meant accepting that you might be turned away yourself someday. So the settlement made room. William's men were divided among several households. The work expected of them was made clear immediately. Help with hunting, repair buildings, process seal meat, tend fires, haul water. There were no guests here, only temporary members of the community. Young Martin was placed with a family that had children. The mother, whose name was Astrid, took one look at his exhausted face and assigned him lighter tasks: tending fires, helping prepare food, minding smaller children while adults worked. Thomas found himself working with Greystone's carpenter, a taciturn man named Bjorn, who spoke little but demonstrated constantly. Together they repaired damaged tools, reinforced walls, and built sleds for winter hunting. Edmund, oldest and most experienced, was paired with the settlement's elders. They recognized in him someone who understood survival, and they shared knowledge freely.
where ice was safe to cross, how to predict storms, which seals were easiest to hunt in winter darkness. William himself worked alongside the hunters. The men of Greystone moved across ice with confidence that bordered on reckless, but it was earned through lifetimes of experience. They taught him to read subtle changes in snow, to smell weather shifts hours before they arrived, to move silently so as not to disturb seals basking near breathing holes. The work was hard, endless, and utterly necessary, but after weeks of helpless stillness in the boat, action felt like medicine. Winter deepened around Greystone. Days shortened until noon felt like twilight. Darkness dominated, broken only by brief periods of weak light that barely cleared the horizon. The cold, already severe, intensified. Temperatures dropped until breath froze audibly, crackling in the air. Exposed skin froze in minutes. Going outside required layers that made movement clumsy, but survival demanded it. The settlement adapted as it always had. Life moved mostly indoors. Families gathered around hearths, working on projects that could be done by firelight, repairing nets, sewing clothing, carving tools from bone and driftwood. Children played games that taught survival skills without naming them as such.
They practiced knots endlessly, tied and untied, until fingers could work without thought. They learned to start fires in increasingly difficult conditions, racing each other to see who could coax flame fastest. William's crew integrated slowly. Language barriers eased through shared work. Misunderstandings about customs happened, but were forgiven quickly. In places like Greystone, everyone was always one mistake from disaster. Rigidity killed as surely as cold. Young Martin thrived unexpectedly. The children accepted him immediately, and he spent hours playing with them, his youth an advantage for the first time since leaving home. Astrid watched him carefully, seeing how he moved between childhood and adulthood, belonging fully to neither. One evening, as Martin helped her prepare seal meat, she spoke quietly. "You'll make a good father someday. You're patient with them." Martin flushed, unused to praise. "I don't know. I'm still learning most things myself." "Everyone is always learning," Astrid replied. "That never stops. But you're gentle. That matters." Thomas, working with Bjorn, discovered that the older man had sailed south years ago, had seen the settlements William's crew came from. They talked about the differences in boat design, in sailing techniques, in how cultures adapted to their environments. "Your boats are made for open water," Bjorn observed one afternoon. "Fast, agile. Ours are wider, slower, stable in ice." Thomas nodded. "We learned that the hard way." Bjorn smiled, rare for him. Everyone learns ice the hard way. There's no other method. Edmund spent long evenings with the elders, listening to stories that were also lessons. They spoke of winters past, of times when hunting failed and food ran low, of storms that lasted days, of ice that behaved unpredictably. The stories weren't meant to frighten. They were meant to teach. Survival here depended on collective memory, on learning from every mistake anyone had ever made. "Ice moves like a living thing," one elder said. "It breathes, shifts, grows. You can't control it. You can only learn its moods and move accordingly." Edmund absorbed every word, recognizing wisdom earned through brutal experience. The first major storm arrived in early December. The people of Greystone recognized its approach days in advance, a certain quality to the wind, a particular color in the pre-dawn sky, seabirds moving inland earlier than usual. Preparations began immediately. Every family secured their homes, piling extra turf on roofs, blocking gaps with packed snow, bringing inside anything that might blow away. Food stores were checked, fuel supplies verified, water collected from snow melted over fires. William helped where directed, learning the rhythm of preparation. This wasn't panic, it was routine. Storms came, you survived them, then life continued. The storm hit on a morning so dark it barely qualified as day. Wind arrived first, not gradually, but all at once, as if someone had opened an enormous door. It howled around buildings, seeking entry, finding every tiny gap and exploiting it mercilessly. Snow followed, not falling gently, but driven horizontally by wind, forming drifts that grew visibly, minute by minute. Within an hour, the world outside ceased to exist. There was only white, moving, impenetrable. Inside, families gathered close to hearths. The fires burned steadily, carefully maintained. Running out of fuel during a storm was a death sentence, so conservation mattered even now. William's crew, scattered among different homes, experienced the storms separately, but the experience was similar everywhere.
confinement, and forced stillness, the constant awareness of wind pressing against walls. In Astrid's home, Martin sat with the children near the fire, helping them practice knots. Outside, the storm raged. Inside, life continued in miniature. Astrid worked on repairing a fishing net, her fingers moving automatically even in the dim light. Her husband, Tor, carved a new handle for a knife that had broken days earlier. The children played quietly, their games subdued by the storm's presence. "How long will it last?" Martin asked. "Days," Astrid answered without looking up. "Maybe a week. Storms here don't hurry." Martin absorbed this. A week confined to this small space. He could see how that might drive people to conflict, how forced proximity and stress could fracture relationships. But he also saw how the family moved around each other with practiced ease. Tasks overlapped without collision. Conversation flowed gently, never demanding attention, but available when needed. They'd learned how to exist together in tight quarters. Thomas, in Bjorn's household, discovered that the carpenter's wife was a storyteller. As the storm howled outside, she told tales of heroes and gods, of journeys across impossible distances, of clever solutions to unsolvable problems. The stories entertained, yes, but they also taught. Characters survived through wit more than strength, through cooperation more than individual prowess. The lessons were subtle but clear. Edmund, with the elders, sat mostly in silence. They didn't need to fill space with words. The fire crackled, the wind roared. Occasionally someone would make an observation about the storm's direction, about how long the fuel would last, about plans for after. These weren't idle thoughts, they were calculations, constant assessments of resources and risks. Survival required mathematics, even if no one wrote equations. William, housed with one of the hunters, learned about reading storm patterns. His host, a man named Eric, explained how different winds carried different risks. From the north, storms are colder but shorter. From the west, they're wetter, last longer. From the east, they're dangerous, ice and wind together. "And this one?" asked William. "West," Eric said. "We'll be inside for days."
He was right. The storm lasted 5 days. 5 days of confinement, of careful fuel management, of existing in spaces barely large enough for the bodies they contained. But when it passed, when wind finally died and snow stopped falling, the community emerged. They dug out doors buried under drifts. They checked on each other systematically. Every household visited, every person accounted for. Everyone had survived. It was expected, but still worth noting. After the storm, the landscape had changed. Snow lay in massive drifts that reshaped familiar terrain. Walking routes needed relearning. Places that had been accessible were now buried. Others, scoured clean by wind, stood exposed. The hunters went out immediately. Storms disrupted seal behavior, sometimes creating opportunities. William joined them, moving across snow that alternated between powder and ice crust. They found seals quickly, a good sign. The hunters worked efficiently, dispatching animals with respect, wasting nothing. Blood steamed in the cold, freezing almost immediately on the snow. The work was hard but satisfying. Bodies moved after days of stillness. Purpose returned. And they brought food back to the settlement, essential protein that would be preserved through freezing and rationing. Young Martin, watching hunters return with their kill, felt something shift inside him. He thought of himself as temporary here, someone passing through until spring allowed travel again. But watching the community work together, seeing how every person contributed to collective survival, he began to understand something. This place, harsh as it was, functioned through cooperation in ways his home settlement never had. Here, your status didn't determine your survival, your contribution did. A child who could tend fire well was as valuable as an adult hunter. An elder who knew weather patterns saved more lives than strength ever could. "You're thinking loud thoughts?" Astrid said, appearing beside him with a basket of snow to melt for water. Martin smiled. "Just noticing things." "Good," she said. "Noticing keeps you alive." Thomas, meanwhile, completed a project with Bjorn. They'd built a new sled, designed with runners that cut through both snow and ice efficiently. It was beautiful in its simplicity, every piece serving multiple functions, no wasted material or effort. Bjorn ran his hand along the finished runners with obvious satisfaction. "Good work. You understand how things fit together." Thomas felt pride swell unexpectedly. He'd built many things in his life, but few had mattered as much as this. This sled would help hunters. It would contribute to survival.
Edmund spent time mapping the area with the elders. They drew in snow, scratching out coastlines and ice patterns, showing him where hunting was best in different seasons, where ice was treacherous, where storms came from. The maps weren't permanent. Snow would erase them soon, but the knowledge transferred was.
Edmund memorized everything, recognizing information that might save lives. William learned to hunt in darkness. With winter at its deepest, true daylight no longer existed. Everything happened in twilight or night, by starlight and feel. The hunters moved with confidence that seemed impossible, but they'd trained for this their entire lives. You learn to trust other senses, Eric explained. Sound, smell, the feeling of ice beneath you. Eyes deceive in darkness. Your body doesn't. William practiced, stumbling at first, then gradually finding a rhythm. It required letting go of the visual world, trusting instincts he hadn't known he possessed. Midwinter arrived, the longest night, the deepest cold, the moment when winter felt most absolute. In Greystone, this was marked with quiet ceremony. The entire settlement gathered in the largest dwelling, a communal space used for meetings and shared meals. Every person attended, from infants to the most fragile elders. A fire burned at the center, fed with precious fuel saved specifically for this night. People sat in concentric circles around it, families together, visitors integrated among them. The ceremony wasn't religious exactly. It was acknowledgement, recognition that they'd reached winter's depth and would now slowly climb back toward light. An elder stood, not the oldest, but one chosen for her clear voice and steady presence. She spoke about cycles, about darkness and return, about endurance. "We have survived to this point," she said simply. "We will survive beyond it." The light returns, slowly but certainly. We are here. We continue. It wasn't dramatic. There were no grand proclamations or emotional speeches. Just truth, stated plainly. They had endured. They would endure further. Then food was shared. Everyone contributed something. Dried fish, seal meat, precious vegetables stored from autumn, bread made from carefully hoarded grain. The meal wasn't lavish, but it was communal. Every person ate the same portions, from youngest to oldest, from permanent resident to temporary visitor. Young Martin, sitting with Astrid's family, felt tears prick his eyes unexpectedly, not from sadness, but from something he couldn't name. Belonging, perhaps, or recognition of shared humanity in circumstances that could easily strip it away. He noticed others were crying too, quietly, without embarrassment. The tears meant something here. They were release, acknowledgement of how hard survival was, permission to feel the weight of it before letting go and continuing. After eating, stories were shared, not grand tales of heroes, but small ones. Funny mistakes made during the year, clever solutions to everyday problems, children being silly, daily life elevated simply by being remembered. Thomas told a story about trying to milk a goat on a ship once, and how the animal had refused spectacularly, resulting in chaos and eventually him overboard. People laughed, the sound warm and genuine in the cold night. Edmund shared a memory of a young sailor, now sitting among them, who'd been terrified of his first storm, but had kept working despite fear. The sailor, Robert, grinned and nodded. No shame in admitting past fear. William spoke briefly about the moment they'd seen Greystone's smoke, how it had felt like seeing salvation itself. His voice broke slightly, and he let it. No need for false strength here. The gathering lasted hours, deep into the darkness. When it finally ended, people departed quietly, heading back to individual homes with something renewed. Not hope exactly, but something sturdier. Determination. Winter's worst was behind them. Light would return, incrementally but inevitably. They would be here to see it. January brought changes. Days lengthened by minutes, barely noticeable day to day, but undeniable over weeks. The sun, when it appeared, climbed slightly higher each time. The cold remained brutal, perhaps even intensified it, but the psychological shift mattered. The community felt it collectively, a slight easing of tension that had been present since autumn. Hunting improved as seals became more active. The hunters ranged farther, sometimes staying out for days, camping on ice in conditions that would have killed William's crew months earlier. But these men had been doing this since childhood. They knew ice like William knew rope and sail. William accompanied them more frequently, learning constantly.
His hands, soft from weeks of inactivity in the boat, had toughened. His body had adapted to constant cold, no longer fighting it quite so hard. One evening, returning from a successful hunt, Eric spoke to him directly. "You move well on ice now, better than many who've lived here longer." William nodded thanks, knowing it was high praise from a man who rarely wasted words on flattery. "You could stay," Eric continued. "After spring, we could use a man who understands boats and water. The settlement would accept you." The offer sat between them, serious and genuine. William didn't answer immediately. He thought about his crew, about the journey south that still awaited, about home. But he also thought about Greystone, about how life here, though hard, felt more honest than life in places where status determined value. Here, you were judged by contribution, by character, by how you handled difficulty. "I'll think on it," William said finally. Eric nodded, expecting nothing more. Thomas faced a similar conversation with Bjorn. The carpenter had been watching Thomas work, noting his skill and attitude. One afternoon, as they finished repairing a boat frame, Bjorn spoke. "You have a gift for this. Not many people understand how materials want to move, what shapes they resist. You do." Thomas smiled. "I've always liked working with wood, making things that last." "Stay here," Eric continued. "Learn our methods. There's always need for someone who builds well." The invitation was straightforward, practical. Thomas considered it seriously.
He had nothing in particular pulling him south. No family waiting, no specific plans beyond survival and the next job. Here, his skills mattered immediately. He could build a life, literal and figurative. "Can I answer in spring?" Thomas asked, "when we know whether the passage south is clear?" "Of course," Bjorn replied. "I don't need an answer. I need good work. You provide that now. If you stay, you'll provide it longer." Young Martin received no such offers, but he felt them in how people interacted with him. Astrid's children had adopted him as an older brother. He'd become part of the family's rhythm, helping without being asked, learning their ways naturally. One evening, Astrid's youngest daughter, only 5, climbed into his lap by the fire. She didn't say anything, just settled there, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. Astrid caught Martin's eye across the room and smiled. The message was clear. You belong here, if you want to. Edmund, interestingly, seemed most committed to leaving. He spoke often about spring, about the journey south, about seeing home again. The others understood. Edmund was older. His time might be running out. He wanted to end his days in familiar places. William respected that. When spring came, when they could sail, anyone who wished to leave would leave. Anyone who wished to stay would stay with the community's blessing. But spring felt distant still, theoretical. Winter remained their reality, demanding attention moment by moment. February arrived with brutal cold. Temperatures dropped to levels that made previous colds seem mild. Air burned lungs. Exposed skin froze in seconds. Simply being outside became dangerous. The community retreated into survival mode. Hunting stopped except for absolute necessity. Fire management became critical. Every household measured fuel obsessively, calculating whether they had enough to last until conditions improved. In Astrid's home, the family huddled close to their hearth, conserving warmth. Martin noticed how carefully Astrid fed the fire now, using the absolute minimum fuel needed to maintain adequate temperature. "How much do we have left?" he asked quietly one evening. Astrid glanced at the fuel pile, doing mental calculations. "Enough if we're careful. The cold won't last forever." But her expression suggested concern. Martin made a decision. The next morning, despite the dangerous cold, he went out with Tor to collect more fuel. Driftwood could still be found along the shore if you knew where to look. Tor led Martin to spots where ocean currents deposited wood, buried now under snow and ice. They dug, working methodically despite the cold, until they'd gathered enough to ease the household's concerns. The work was punishing. Martin's hands, even wrapped in layers, went numb. His face ached. But when they returned, dragging sleds loaded with fuel, Astrid's relief was worth it. "You didn't have to do that," she said quietly. "Yes, I did," Martin replied simply. "This is my family too." Something passed between them then, an acknowledgement of bonds formed through shared survival. Thomas and Bjorn,
unable to work on building projects in the extreme cold, spent time inside teaching younger members of the settlement. Bjorn demonstrated joinery techniques using small pieces of wood. Thomas showed them how to read wood grain, how to anticipate how pieces would fit. The children watched with intense focus, absorbing knowledge that would serve them their entire lives. Edmund, with the elders, went through supplies systematically. They inventoried everything: food, fuel, tools, clothing. The accounting was precise, almost meditative. Knowing exactly what you had was the first step in making it last. "We're in good shape," one elder concluded after days of counting. "Not comfortable, but sufficient. We'll make it to spring." Edmund nodded, reassured. He'd lived through winters before where that conclusion couldn't be reached, where desperation replaced confidence. William, with the hunters, discussed strategies for when conditions allowed hunting to resume. They couldn't go out now, but they could plan. Where seals would be as weather changed, which routes would become accessible first, how to make up for lost hunting time. Eric drew maps in ash on the hearthstone, showing patterns of seal migration, explaining how animals behave differently in extreme cold versus merely severe cold. The knowledge was fascinating. William began to see how interconnected everything was here. Weather affected ice, ice affected seals, seals affected human survival. Everything linked in chains of cause and effect. One night, as wind howled especially loudly, shaking the house despite its sturdy construction, Eric spoke thoughtfully. "The sea ice is breaking up out there. You can hear it in the wind. Spring ice sounds different, sharper." William listened. At first he heard only wind. Then, beneath it, something else. Cracks, creaks, groaning ice under pressure. The frozen sea was beginning to shift. "How long until we can travel?" William asked. "Months still," Eric answered. "Ice breaks up slowly, dangerously. Better to wait until it's completely clear than risk crossing during the transition." William understood. Impatience killed as surely as cold. They would wait. The extreme cold broke in mid-February. Not dramatically, but temperatures rose enough to allow movement again. The community emerged cautiously, checking on each other, assessing damage. Several roofs had been damaged by wind and needed repair. A storage building had partially collapsed under snow weight. Tools had been lost or broken. But no one had died. That mattered most. Repairs began immediately. Thomas worked with Bjorn and others, fixing what winter had damaged. The work felt good after weeks of confinement, purposeful and forward-looking. Young Martin helped where he could, learning rapidly.
Astrid watched him with quiet pride, seeing how he'd changed from the uncertain boy who'd arrived months ago. Hunting resumed carefully. The hunters moved out in pairs, testing conditions, verifying that ice was stable enough to support them. Early attempts were cautious, conservative, but gradually confidence returned. William went out with Eric, tracking seals across ice that was beginning its slow transformation toward spring. The surface changed, less uniformly solid, more textured and varied. They moved carefully, testing each step. They found seals sunning themselves near breathing holes, lethargic after weeks of extreme cold. The hunting was careful, respectful. Each animal taken was used completely: meat for eating, fat for fuel and waterproofing, skin for clothing and tools. Nothing was wasted. Waste was unthinkable here. Returning with their kill, William felt something he hadn't expected: satisfaction that went beyond successful work. He'd contributed meaningfully to the community's survival. He was part of something larger than himself. That evening, processing the seal meat with Eric and others, he made his decision. "I'd like to stay," William said quietly. "Not just until spring, longer." Eric nodded, unsurprised. "You're welcome. You work well. You learn. Those are the qualities that matter." It was that simple. No ceremony, no official declaration. Just acceptance. Thomas made a similar choice. Working with Bjorn felt right in ways that previous work never had. The projects here mattered immediately and obviously. He could see the direct impact of his labor on people's survival. "I'll stay," he told Bjorn one afternoon. Bjorn's response was characteristically brief. "Good. We'll build a house for you when weather allows. Until then, you sleep here." Young Martin didn't announce a decision because none seemed necessary. He was already part of Astrid's family, already integrated into the settlement's children, already home. Edmund, however, remained committed to leaving. He spoke with William about it directly, wanting to ensure there were no hard feelings. "I need to see home again," Edmund explained. "I'm old. I need to close certain circles before I can't." William understood completely. "When ice clears, we'll help you prepare a boat, supplies, whatever you need." Edmund smiled gratefully. "Thank you. I know it's selfish, wanting to leave when spring comes, when work here will be heaviest." "It's not selfish," countered William. "Everyone follows their path. Yours leads south. Ours stay here." Several others from the original crew chose to leave with Edmund: Robert, John, and Peter. They'd experienced enough of northern life to know it wasn't for them. They wanted warmer lands, familiar seas, different challenges. The rest chose to stay. They'd found something here they hadn't known they were seeking. March arrived with noticeable change.
Daylight returned properly. Not just brief twilight, but actual sun above the horizon for hours. The transformation was remarkable. Warmth was still relative. Temperatures remained well below freezing, but the sun's presence mattered psychologically. People emerged more, moved more freely, worked outside for longer periods. The landscape began its slow transformation. Snow softened during the day, refroze at night, creating surface conditions that changed hourly. Ice along the shore cracked and shifted, revealing open water in places. Seabirds returned, their cries marking the change of season as surely as any calendar. The hunters smiled hearing them, knowing that migration meant change. Change meant spring. Spring meant abundance after winter's scarcity. The community's children, who'd spent months confined to small spaces, exploded into outdoor activity. They ran, slid on ice, built snow structures, reveling in space and light. Young Martin joined them, his youth an asset again. He organized games, taught them skills learned during winter, and generally helped channel their energy productively. Astrid watched him with maternal satisfaction. He'd become the son she'd never had, filling a space in her family that had been empty. Thomas began a major project with Bjorn, expanding the workshop. With another skilled carpenter staying permanently, more space was needed. They designed carefully, creating a structure that would withstand next winter's storms while providing good working conditions. The work was satisfying, forward-looking. Thomas built for a future he'd be present to see, for a place he belonged to completely. William, meanwhile, learned to fish through ice with Eric. They drilled holes, set lines, and waited with patient stillness. The catch was modest but important, diversifying food sources beyond seal meat alone. Eric taught him to read ice thickness by sound, by color, by feel, skills that seemed impossible to learn, but gradually became intuitive through practice and attention. One afternoon, waiting by a fishing hole, Eric spoke thoughtfully. "Your friend, the old one, he's wise to leave if his heart pulls that direction. Staying where you don't belong kills as surely as staying where you do." William nodded. "Edmund knows himself. I respect that." "And you? You know yourself?" William considered. "I'm learning. This place teaches me things I didn't know I needed to learn." "Good," Eric said simply. "That's how you know you're where you should be. The learning never stops feeling important." As March progressed, the crew who decided to leave began preparing. The community helped willingly, understanding that departure was as valid a choice as staying. A boat was selected, smaller than the one they'd arrived in, but sufficient for 4 men heading south. Supplies were gathered and carefully packed. The community contributed generously, giving more than seemed fair, ensuring the travelers had margins for error.
Edmund supervised preparations with characteristic thoroughness. He checked every rope, every seal on containers, every piece of equipment. He'd made this journey before, though in the opposite direction. He knew what was required. One evening, he sat with William near a fire, watching the sun set later than it had in months. "No regrets?" Edmund asked. "None," William answered honestly. "This is where I belong. I didn't know it before, but I know it now." Edmund smiled. "You've changed. You move differently, talk differently. This place has shaped you." "Is that bad?" "Not at all. We're supposed to be shaped by where we live. That's how we know we're truly living there." They sat in comfortable silence, 2 men who'd survived together, now choosing different paths forward. April arrived with dramatic transformation. Ice began breaking up in earnest, not gradually, but suddenly, enormous sheets cracking apart under pressure of tidal shifts and warming temperatures. The sound was extraordinary, booming cracks that echoed across the landscape, groaning complaints as ice that had been solid for months shattered into fragments.
The community watched with mixed feelings. Breakup meant spring, meant access to open water again, meant easier hunting and travel. It also meant danger. Moving ice was unpredictable, deadly to anyone caught wrong. Hunting ceased temporarily. The ice hunters used was no longer stable enough to trust. They'd resume from boats once open water expanded, but for now, everyone stayed close to shore. The crew preparing to leave monitored conditions carefully. They needed open water to sail, but not so early that ice still posed navigation hazards. Timing mattered critically. William helped them prepare, ensuring nothing was overlooked. He felt sadness at the departure, but no doubt about his own choice. This was right for everyone. Young Martin helped provision the boat, working alongside Robert, John, and Peter. They'd become friends over the winter, shared experiences creating bonds. "You are sure about staying?" Robert asked Martin one afternoon. "Completely," Martin answered. "I'm home here." Robert nodded understanding. "I need something different, warmer, easier, but I understand why you'd stay." Thomas felt similar exchanges with those leaving. No judgment, just acknowledgement that people needed different things. The departure date was set for mid-April, when ice had cleared enough to allow safe passage, but weather remained stable enough for small boat travel. The night before, the community held a farewell gathering. Nothing formal, just people sharing a meal and stories, marking the moment. Edmund spoke, his voice strong despite his age. "Can't be repaid, only honored through how we live afterward." The elder who had spoken at midwinter responded, "There is no debt. You worked beside us. You survived with us.
That makes you part of us, whether you stay or go." It was simple, profound, honest. Later, Edmund spoke privately with William. "Take care of the young one, Martin. He's stronger than he knows, but he'll need guidance still." "I will," William promised. "And you take care of yourself. Get home. Close your circles." They embraced briefly, two men who'd faced death together, now parting with mutual respect. The next morning, the boat launched. 4 men aboard, supplies packed carefully, destination clear. The community gathered to watch, offering no dramatic farewells, just raised hands and quiet blessings. The boat moved away from shore, catching wind, heading south toward waters that would gradually warm, toward lands more forgiving than these. William watched until it disappeared from view. Then he turned back toward Greystone, toward the life he'd chosen, toward home. Summer in Greystone was brief but glorious. The sun barely set, creating endless days where work and life blended seamlessly. The community exploded into activity, making the most of every warm day. Hunting was abundant. Seals were everywhere, fat and healthy. Fish returned to coastal waters in massive schools. Birds nested on cliffs, their eggs harvested carefully to supplement diets. Gardens appeared in sheltered spots, small plots where hardy vegetables grew quickly in the constant light. Potatoes, turnips, tough greens that could survive occasional frosts. The expansion of Bjorn's workshop completed. Thomas had designed clever details, shutters that could seal completely against winter wind, but open fully to let in summer light and air. Storage built into walls, workbenches at perfect heights. It was, Bjorn declared, the finest workshop he'd ever worked in. High praise from a man who'd been building for 40 years. Young Martin spent much of summer exploring the landscape with Greystone's children. They ranged far from the settlement, learning the terrain intimately, finding berry patches and bird nesting sites, mapping their world through experience. Astrid occasionally worried about them ranging so far, but Tor reminded her that children here learned independence early, coddling killed as surely as neglect. Martin returned each evening tired, sunburned, and happy. He'd found a kind of freedom here he'd never experienced in his more structured home settlement. William, meanwhile, had become a full member of the hunting crews. He no longer needed Eric's guidance. He knew the waters, knew the ice, knew the seals. His contribution was no longer that of a learner, but a full partner. One evening, after a particularly successful hunt, Eric spoke to him directly. "You're one of us now. Not a visitor, not even someone who stayed, just one of us." It was, William realized, exactly what he'd hoped for without knowing to hope for it. The community celebrated summer with work, yes, but also with joy. Music appeared. Simple drums and singing, no elaborate instruments, but heartfelt and communal. Children danced. Adults relaxed slightly, allowing themselves pleasure earned through survival. There was a night in late June when the sun never truly set, just circled the horizon, painting the sky in constant twilight. The entire community stayed up, watching, marveling at the phenomenon they saw every year but never took for granted.
Martin sat with Astrid's family, watching the sky change colors. Tor's arm rested across Martin's shoulders, casual and paternal. "This is what we survive winter for," Tor said quietly. These moments." Martin nodded, understanding. Winter wasn't something to endure and forget. It was the price paid for summer's beauty. Both were necessary. Both were real. As July arrived, talk began about preparations for next winter. Always thinking ahead was survival. Fuel needed gathering. Food needed preserving. Repairs needed completing before cold returned. Thomas and Bjorn began planning projects for winter. New sleds, boat repairs, tools that needed crafting. Work that could happen indoors when outside became impossible again. The cycle continued, seasonal and eternal. Summer's abundance prepared for winter's scarcity. Winter's endurance earned summer's joy. William, working on preserving seal meat one afternoon, realized he couldn't remember exactly why he'd been so eager to find that northern passage originally. Trading routes? Faster travel? It seemed distant now. Irrelevant. He'd found something more valuable than a shortcut. He'd found a place where life made sense, where contribution mattered more than status, where survival itself was noble rather than merely expected. August brought the first hints of autumn. Days shortened noticeably now. Frost appeared some mornings, killing tender plants but leaving hardier ones to mature. The community shifted into preservation mode. Everything harvested was immediately processed. Fish dried or frozen, meat smoked or packed in snow, vegetables stored in root cellars dug deep enough to resist freezing. It was exhausting work, but everyone participated. Children helped where they could. Elders supervised, ensuring nothing was wasted. Young Martin learned preservation techniques from Astrid. How to smoke fish so it would last months. How to render seal fat into oil that could fuel lamps through winter darkness. How to store food so moisture couldn't ruin it. The knowledge was practical, immediate, and utterly essential. Martin absorbed it eagerly, recognizing that he was learning to survive independently. Thomas spent August completing outdoor projects before cold made such work impossible. The workshop needed a final weatherproofing layer. Several boats required repairs. Fuel stores needed proper coverage. Bjorn worked beside him, increasingly treating Thomas as an equal partner rather than apprentice. The transition was gradual but unmistakable.
William joined the final hunting expeditions of open water season. These trips ranged farther, targeting seals that were fattening for winter, storing energy that would translate to richer meat for the community. The hunting was successful but bittersweet. Each trip might be the last before ice returned. The ocean, so accessible now, would soon become impassable again. One evening, returning from hunting, William stood at the shore watching the sunset. The light was different now, lower, richer in color. Autumn light. Eric joined him quietly. "Thinking about winter?" "Always," William answered. "Is that how it works here? Summer thinking about winter, winter thinking about summer?" "Mostly," Eric confirmed. "The present matters, but survival lives in preparation. You can't enjoy summer without preparing for winter. Can't survive winter without remembering summer exists." "I'm ready," William said. "For winter, for whatever it brings." Eric smiled. "Good, because it's coming whether you're ready or not." September arrived with rapidly shortening days. Frost became permanent. The ocean began its slow freeze, ice forming first in sheltered bays, then spreading outward. The community pulled inward physically and socially. Houses were sealed against coming cold. Families gathered indoors more frequently. The rhythm shifted from expansion to contraction. But there was no fear, just preparation. This was the cycle, annual and expected. Winter would come. They would survive it. Spring would return. Martin, now fully integrated into Astrid's household, helped prepare their home for winter, checking roof integrity, sealing gaps, organizing supplies so everything would be accessible even in darkness and cold. He worked with confidence born from experience. He'd survived one winter here. He could survive another. Thomas and Bjorn finished the last outdoor projects as snow began falling more frequently. The workshop was ready. Winter work can begin as soon as confinement demanded it. William helped hunting crews make final expeditions onto forming ice, carefully, testing its thickness, taking advantage of every possible day before it became too dangerous. The community gathered one evening in early October, marking the shift into winter routine. It wasn't ceremony exactly, just acknowledgement. The same elder who'd spoken at midwinter stood by the central fire. "Another cycle begins. We know what's ahead. We've prepared well. We'll survive together, as we always have." Simple words, but they carried weight.
This community had survived countless winters through cooperation, preparation, and mutual support. Martin looked around the gathering, seeing faces he now knew as well as his own family. Thomas, working beside Bjorn. William, standing with the hunters. The families he'd played with, worked with, survived with. This was home. Not the place he'd been born, but the place he belonged. Winter settled over Greystone like a familiar cloak. Heavy, yes.
Demanding, yes, but expected and manageable. The wind howled outside, the stone hearth glowed warm inside, and life continued, season by season, in the place where Martin and the others had learned that survival wasn't just about not dying. It was about finding where you belonged and building a life there worth surviving for. As winter deepened once again, the community settled into rhythms that were now familiar to William, Thomas, and Martin. The cold returned, yes, but it was no longer surprising. The darkness descended, but they'd learned how to live within it. This winter felt different from the last. Not easier, winter was never easy here, but more comprehensible. They understood its patterns now, its demands and gifts. Martin, now 17, had grown noticeably, not just in height, but in competence and confidence. He moved through winter tasks with practiced efficiency, no longer needing instruction for most things. Astrid watched him with maternal satisfaction. In many ways, he'd become the son she'd always wanted, filling a space in the family naturally and completely. One evening, as they worked together preparing seal meat, she spoke thoughtfully. "You'll need to start thinking about your future here, whether you want your own household eventually or whether you'll stay with us." Martin paused, considering. He'd thought about this, but vaguely. Now Astrid was asking him to think concretely. "I don't know yet," he answered honestly. "I feel like I'm still learning." "You'll always be learning," Astrid replied. "That never stops. But there comes a time when you learn as a leader rather than a follower." Martin nodded slowly. Leadership here didn't mean authority exactly. It meant taking responsibility for others' survival, contributing at a level that shaped the community rather than just supporting it. "I'll think about it," he promised. Thomas, meanwhile, had fully established himself as Bjorn's partner in the carpentry work. They'd taken on an apprentice, a young boy named Eric, named after the hunter, a common name here, and Thomas found teaching deeply satisfying. Watching young Eric struggle with the same challenges Thomas had faced, seeing him gradually understand how wood and tools work together, felt like passing on something valuable. Bjorn, growing older, increasingly let Thomas handle major decisions about projects. The transition was happening naturally, without formal acknowledgement, as these things did in Greystone. William had become one of the settlement's most skilled hunters. His outsider perspective occasionally allowed him to see solutions that lifelong residents missed, while his adopted local knowledge made those solutions practical. He'd begun teaching others some of the sailing techniques from his former life, showing how they could apply to hunting from boats during brief summer seasons. The knowledge exchange went both ways, enriching both giver and receiver. One afternoon, returning from a successful hunt, he realized he rarely thought about his former life anymore. Not because he'd forgotten, but because it no longer felt like real life. This was real. Everything before had been preparation. The winter passed through its familiar stages. Bitter cold in December and January, slight moderation in February, the first hints of returning light in March. Each phase brought its challenges and rhythms. The community survived through continued cooperation. When one family's fuel ran low, others shared. When someone fell ill, everyone contributed to their care. When children grew restless from confinement, adults created activities and games that taught while entertaining. This was how survival worked here, not through individual strength, but through collective resilience. Martin participated fully in this network, no longer as someone being helped, but as someone contributing meaningfully. When young Eric's family needed extra hands for a difficult repair, Martin was there. When an elder needed help managing their fuel stores, Martin helped without being asked. He'd learned the fundamental truth of Greystone. You survived because others helped you survive, and they survived because you helped them. The reciprocity was absolute and essential. As spring began its slow return, the community assessed how winter had treated them. Some losses: an elder had died peacefully in his sleep, his body given to the sea with honor. Some gains: a child had been born, healthy and strong, welcomed with quiet joy. Overall, they'd survived well. Food stores remained adequate, fuel had lasted, no catastrophes had occurred. Spring arrived with familiar transformations: ice breaking, birds returning,
light lengthening dramatically. The community exploded into activity, making up for winter's confinement. This year, William took on a major project. He wanted to design a new type of boat, combining the ice-resilient features of Greystone's vessels with some of the speed and maneuverability of Southern designs. The idea intrigued the community. Boats were life here, the difference between successful hunting and starvation. Any improvement mattered enormously. Eric and the other hunters worked with William, discussing what they needed from a hunting vessel: stability in rough water, ability to navigate through broken ice, sufficient speed to pursue seals, storage for equipment and catch. Thomas and Bjorn contributed construction knowledge: what was buildable with available materials, what designs would hold up under the stresses of ice and cold. The project became community, with various people contributing ideas and expertise. This was how innovation happened in Greystone, through collective effort and shared knowledge. By midsummer, they'd built a prototype. It was tested cautiously at first, then more aggressively as confidence grew.
The design worked remarkably well, addressing several limitations of previous boats while introducing no new problems. The community celebrated the success quietly but genuinely. This boat would improve hunting efficiency, which directly meant better survival chances in future winters. William felt deep satisfaction. He'd contributed something significant, something that would outlast him, something that would help the community for generations. Young Martin, watching the boat's successful testing, felt inspired. He began thinking about his own potential contributions. What could he offer that would matter as much? He discussed it with Tor one evening. "I want to do something important, something that helps us all." Tor smiled. "You already do, every day. But I understand wanting something more. That's good. That's how we improve." "But what?" Martin pressed. "I'm not a hunter like William, not a builder like Thomas." "You're good with children," Tor observed. "You teach them well. They listen to you. Maybe that's your contribution, teaching the next generation." Martin considered this. Teaching wasn't as dramatic as designing boats or leading hunts, but it mattered. Children were literally the future. Teaching them well meant the community would continue, would survive, would thrive. "Maybe," Martin said thoughtfully. "I'll think about it." Summer passed too quickly, as it always did. Abundance and light felt fleeting, even while they lasted. Everyone worked constantly, storing supplies, completing projects, preparing for the winter they knew was coming. Thomas and Bjorn began training young Eric more seriously. The boy showed promise, and with Bjorn aging, ensuring the next generation had necessary skills was vital. William refined the new boat design based on summer's testing. Small adjustments improved performance further. By autumn, he'd trained several other hunters in operating it effectively. Martin made a decision. He would become the settlement's dedicated teacher for children. He'd create structured learning that combined practical skills with stories and games, ensuring children absorbed knowledge they'd need for survival while remaining engaged. Astrid supported the idea enthusiastically. "You'll be good at it. You understand them. You remember being young enough that you don't expect too much, but you're old enough to teach effectively." He began planning curriculum, if such a formal word applied to informal education. Knot tying, fire starting, ice safety, weather reading, navigation by stars, first aid, food preservation, tool maintenance. All the knowledge that meant survival, broken into lessons appropriate for different ages. The first formal teaching sessions began in autumn, before winter confinement fully set in. Martin gathered children in the communal space, organizing them by age and ability. He made learning feel like play, while ensuring they absorbed critical information. Knot tying became competitive.
Fire starting became a race. Ice safety became storytelling about hunters' experiences. The children loved it. Parents noticed their kids were learning faster, retaining more, gaining confidence. Martin had found his contribution. As another winter approached, the community felt secure. Preparations had been thorough. Supplies were abundant. New innovations like William's boat design promised future improvements. But more than material preparations, the community was strong socially. Relationships were solid. Trust was high. People knew they could depend on each other. This was what made survival possible. Not just physical resources, but social cohesion. The first snow fell in early October. Light, almost playful, but everyone recognized it as warning. Winter was announcing its return. Final preparations intensified. Every household checked and rechecked supplies, seals, fuel stores. Nothing could be overlooked. Martin helped Astrid's family while also preparing the communal space where he'd continue teaching children throughout winter. He wanted it organized so lessons could continue even in darkest, coldest months. Thomas completed the last outdoor building projects, then shifted to preparing the workshop for winter use. Tools organized, materials stored, projects planned for dark months ahead. William joined the final hunting expeditions, bringing in as much seal meat as possible before ice made hunting too dangerous. The community gathered one evening in late October, marking the transition into winter mode. The same elder spoke, her words familiar now, but still meaningful. Another cycle, another winter. We're prepared. We'll survive together. Simple truth, powerfully stated. Martin looked around at faces now completely familiar. Thomas, William, Bjorn, Eric, Astrid, Tor, all the families and individuals who'd become his world. This was home, fully and completely, not where he'd been born, but where he belonged. Winter descended, the wind howled, the stone hearths glowed, and life continued in Greystone, season by season, generation by generation, through the simple, profound act of people choosing to survive together. Years passed in Greystone. Winters came and went, each different in details, but similar in essence. The community endured, adapted, and occasionally thrived. William, now approaching 40, had become one of the settlement's respected elders. Not the oldest, but someone whose opinion carried weight in decisions affecting the community. His boat designs had been refined further, incorporated into the settlement's standard practices. Several vessels now used principles he'd introduced, making hunting more efficient and safer. He'd never married, choosing instead to remain part of Eric's extended household, contributing to the community's welfare rather than establishing his own family line. It was a valid choice here, where contribution mattered more than biological legacy.
Thomas had fully taken over from Bjorn, who'd passed away peacefully 5 years after William's crew had arrived. The old carpenter had lived to see his knowledge successfully transferred to the next generation. Thomas now trained multiple apprentices, ensuring skills would continue. He'd become known for innovative designs that combined practical function with surprising beauty. His work was valued throughout the region. He'd married a woman from a neighboring settlement, bringing fresh connections and knowledge to Greystone. Their 2 children were growing up learning both carpentry and hunting, preparing to contribute however their talents developed. Young Martin, no longer young, now in his mid-20s, had become the settlement's primary teacher. Every child passed through his instruction, learning survival skills, organized systematically, and taught effectively. He'd married Astrid and Tor's daughter, creating a formal bond with the family that had informally adopted him years earlier. They had a child of their own now, a son who was just beginning to learn the basics Martin would teach him. Martin's contribution to Greystone was subtle but profound. The children he taught became more competent, more confident, more able to contribute meaningfully at younger ages. The community's overall resilience improved generation by generation. The 3 original crew members who'd stayed had become permanent fixtures of Greystone. New arrivals sometimes appeared, traders, travelers, occasional refugees from harsher settlements, and William, Thomas, and Martin helped integrate them the way they'd been integrated. The cycle continued. Some stayed, some left. The community absorbed those who fit, wished well those who didn't. No judgment, just acceptance of human variety. Edmund had reached home 5 years after leaving Greystone. Word had come through trading networks. He'd closed his circles, died peacefully the following winter, satisfied with his life's journey. William felt sadness at the news, but also satisfaction. Edmund had done what he needed to do. His path had been different, but equally valid. Robert, John, and Peter had also survived the journey south. They'd returned to their former lives, carrying stories of the North that most listeners found hard to believe. Stories of cold beyond imagination, of communities surviving through cooperation, of people who chose harsh lands because they offered something warmer places didn't: clarity, purpose, meaning earned through shared endurance. On a winter evening, 20 years after his arrival, William sat with Martin by a fire in the communal space. Thomas was there too, along with Eric the hunter, now old, Martin's wife and children, and several other families. It was a gathering like countless others they'd shared over 2 decades. Stories were told, food was shared, children played, life continued. At some point, Martin's son asked the question children always asked eventually.
"Tell me about before, when you came here." William smiled. He told this story many times, but it never got old. "We were lost," he began simply, "frozen in ice, thinking we might die. But we survived because we found people who knew how to survive, and they shared that knowledge freely." "Were you scared?" the boy asked. "Terrified," William admitted honestly, "but fear becomes manageable when you have work to do and people depending on you." Martin added his part. "I was just a boy, barely older than you are now. I didn't know anything, but people taught me patiently, let me learn at my own pace, helped me become who I am. Thomas contributed too. I thought I knew how to build things. I did, sort of, but this place taught me to build for survival, not just for show. That changed everything. The boy listened intently, absorbing not just the story, but the lessons within it. Cooperation mattered. Teaching mattered. Finding where you belonged mattered. Later, as people began departing for their own homes, Eric, the hunter, spoke to William quietly. "You made a good choice, staying. You've given much to this place." William nodded thanks. "It's given me more. Purpose, belonging, a life that matters." "All lives matter," Eric countered gently, "but some people find places where their life matters in ways they can see and touch. You found that. That's rare." William considered. "Maybe I didn't find it. Maybe it found me. We were lost in ice, and the ice brought us here." Eric smiled. "However it happened, you're here now. That's what counts." As William walked back toward Eric's house, still his home after all these years, he looked up at the night sky. Stars blazed overhead, undimmed by human lights. The aurora danced in sheets of green and purple. Beautiful, harsh, real. He thought about his younger self, setting out to find a northern passage, thinking speed and efficiency were what mattered. That man had been looking for shortcuts. This man had learned that some journeys have no shortcuts. Some things must be experienced fully, season by season, year by year, to be understood. Survival wasn't just about not dying. It was about finding meaning in the struggle, about connecting with others who shared the struggle, about contributing something that would outlast your own life. He'd found that in Greystone. 20 winters of cold, 20 summers of abundance, 20 years of belonging. As he reached the house, he paused, feeling the cold night air on his face. It stung, as it always did, but he'd learned long ago that the stung meant he was alive. Inside, warmth waited, community waited, home waited. He stepped through the door, and it closed behind him, shutting out the wind. Inside, the stone hearth glowed steady and warm. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, as it always did, but tonight there was warmth, safety, and the quiet satisfaction of knowing he was exactly where he belonged.
Thank you for joining us on this journey through ice and endurance, through finding home in unexpected places. If you enjoyed this story, if it helped you relax or drift toward peaceful sleep, please consider subscribing to our channel. We share many stories like this one, tales of survival, of resilience, of finding meaning in struggle. Stories designed to calm your mind and carry you gently into rest. Until next time, may you find warmth wherever winter finds you.